No, I dropped my pen. We're live. He's Mike Niziolek. I'm Zach Osterman. Hey, folks, this is Mind Your Banners from March 17th, 2025. I think this is the largest. We had 30 people jump in here, Mike. Normally we start at like 7 or 8. We kind of work our way up, but we're hitting the front running today. There's a lot to talk about. We're going to cover a lot of ground, so I'll ask Mike just to go ahead and launch us in. The question on everyone's mind: how excited were you to see how good Spencer Strider looked in his first rehab start of the spring?
I don't even know who Spencer Strider is.
Yes, you do. Everyone knows who Spencer Strider is.
Strider was a video game. Is he a cousin of the main character in the old Genesis video game?
I mean, he could be. I wouldn't rule it out.
Maybe that's it.
Let's start. Just kind of put a bow on the season, the men's season. Then we're going to talk. Caleb Boggs says, "Go Braves." Caleb knows ball. Caleb knows ball. Put a bow on the men's season. Talk about the women's tournament selection, and then we'll dig into kind of what happens from here with the on the men's side, the portal, the search, etc. First on the sort of the way it all unfolded, it was interesting. I was sitting next to Brian Tonsoni from Delphi Bracketology. I think I texted you this on Saturday at press row at the Big Ten tournament. And Brian was basically just kind of digging into some of the metrics and some of the predictive metrics, some of the results-based stuff for a bunch of different bubble teams. And he just said, every time I rank, these 5, 6, 7 teams, I think he had Texas, UNC, Xavier, Boise State, a couple others, mixed in. He said, every time I kind of go through and rank these teams based on their metrics, Indiana's always consistently near the bottom of the list. Brian's here. Hey, Brian, thank you for all the guidance. I was very excited. Very excited to announce that Brian was in the room with us. And that was kind of the first time that maybe I thought Indiana was really in trouble, was just kind of when I watched somebody who's a lot smarter about the bracket stuff than I am, just kind of stack it all up together. And ultimately, we find out Sunday night that Indiana's not just not in the field, but Indiana's not even the first team out of the field. So Indiana's kind of exempt from a lot of this furor around UNC and Bubba Cunningham and all that stuff. Ultimately, I think it is fair to say that the committee just thought Indiana's resume just frankly did not carry nearly enough weight when you talk about the way Indiana didn't challenge itself in the non-conference, which was something that we, I think not just us, but we certainly kind of pointed out in the preseason, the lack of wins over NCAA tournament teams, and just, a feeling that Indiana wasted too many opportunities, frankly, down the stretch. We can name all the games, but I think that just, all those things kind of rolled in together to keep Indiana out of the field.
I think it's like twofold. I have two thoughts about this. One, I think it's interesting. I mean, interesting is not the right word. I think it's look, some of the fan base was upset, but I think most of the fan base sort of gets it, right? Like when you watched Indiana, they just didn't play or look like a tournament team most of the season. And we'd kind of joked, when Mike Woodson after the Oregon game, look, we're playing our best and we're a 5-5 team over the last 10 games. It's like, well, if this is your best, you're probably not a tournament team. We're peaking and just like, he's like, but you probably have to ignore today because we didn't play very well. It's just like, so like, yeah. I don't know.
Yeah,
it's
no.
It's
I think what I wrote after the game was like, Indiana probably is playing its best basketball now. And this is the result. So sort of what is that?
You can't be consistently the top 8 teams in the conference, essentially. And so, the tournament teams in the conference. And so, I get why they're not a tournament team. Having said that, I don't really get why they're not a tournament team based on the you said you were looking for common data points and inconsistency and sort of like how they measured these teams. And I thought if North Carolina got in, that was a good sign for Indiana, because that meant strength of schedule was valued, and Indiana actually had a harder strength of schedule. They did have a lot of quad one opportunities that they didn't win, but they played in a conference that, was much harder. And so, I thought they sort of had similar reasons why you'd put them in, but then they split the difference. And then there was a quote today about how Indiana just didn't take advantage of their quad one opportunities, and North Carolina was 1-12. So it's like, you want. I think in general you want. I just think in general you wanted more consistency from the committee or what they're presenting. Like if they had these analytics that showed go into those or why why
some of the analytics. I mean, North Carolina. I did a side by side comparison, or I guess it would be a side by side comparison of Texas, Xavier, Indiana, and UNC. I didn't include West Virginia because I don't really understand how the committee could justify leaving West Virginia out, but. If you looked at those four, I mean, for example, UNC was the highest ranked in KenPom. UNC was the highest ranked in the net. UNC was, I think, had far and away the best non-conference strength of schedule, which is, I think the committee, the non-conference strength of schedule, I think matters to the committee because that's the one you have control over. Yes, I agree with the broader principle that I think UNC is 1-12 in quad ones. With, I think, a quad 3 loss, Indiana's 4-13 in quad ones with no loss outside quad 1. I don't understand how you can take your own metric. The net is the NCAA's thing. I don't really understand how you can take your own metric and say, actually, the results that it produced just don't matter. But what where I do have some time for the argument non-conference strength of schedule is teams control that. UNC can't control the fact that the ACC stinks. It can control that it went out and played UCLA. It played. I'll find it. I mean, it doesn't take but a second here to find UNC because they were in the 30s in KenPom. They were 33rd in KenPom. They played Dayton on a neutral floor. They played Auburn, Michigan State on neutral floors, Alabama at home, Florida in what they call a semi-home game. Now they lost most of these games. I get that, but the point is they still played them. Kansas, they played away, whereas Indiana basically just put all of its eggs in the Bahamas basket, which, as we said at the time, was that's fine, but you better win one or two of those games then, because you're not going to have anything to show for a relatively weak non-conference schedule if you don't get something out of Atlantis. And ultimately, the two wins of any note that Indiana picks up in the non-conference are against teams that finish with a combined 8 conference wins. South Carolina won 2 games in the SEC. Providence won 6 in the Big East. Those wins meant next to nothing. And I think that the one area where I do have some time for the reasoning behind getting North Carolina in is that I think, at least over Indiana, North Carolina clearly tried to challenge itself. And
but that's not the argument the committee's making. So you can make it nicely and that makes sense to me, but it is disheartening. And I think for fans of any fan base, the West Virginia thing, obviously most notably, that there's not sort of any kind of coherent calculus that they've sort of described as to how they've made these decisions, it seems like. And whereas you could come up with your own and you can kind of sift through the data and look at it, and sort of make it all fit. I just think that what's being presented publicly has not done that.
I guess just to sort of put a bit of a bow on the season, because I think we've discussed so much, a lot of what kind of gets Indiana to where Indiana winds up. Number one, we know at least 4 players are gone: Trey Galloway, Anthony Leal, Umar Ballo, Langdon Hatton. A 5th that went through senior day, Luke Goody, told you, and I think others, but you were there, post-game Thursday, that he will pursue a 5th year of eligibility. He only played 10 games in Illinois' sophomore season. According to the old rules, technically, if any of your games come in the second half of your season, you're not supposed to be able to get the red shirt retroactively. But as a good friend of mine is fond of saying, under the current climate, if there's any question about whether you have eligibility left, you almost certainly do in the NCAA.
Well, his point was a good one.
No, hold on. Let me just get through and then the last one is just worth saying, and I don't know that it's going to matter a lot for Indiana, but we'll see. Dallas James technically can get this year back, I believe, because he didn't play at all. So the point is, 4 players guaranteed to be gone, 2 more that either could get that year back or are going to try and get that year back, and then everybody else It is worth saying we're talking on Monday afternoon. The portal is open for Indiana players starting today. That's not a huge deal because it would be open in a week anyway. But when your coach when your coach leaves or is fired, that automatically triggers a 30-day portal window independent of the normal calendar. So if you see some Indiana players entering the portal rather than just sort of declaring their intention to enter the portal in the next 7 days, that is why they're allowed to do it. Now, sorry, for you with Luke Goody.
Oh, my thing was with Goody was just that his point was that it would be it's sort of anti-competitive. Like he was selfless in the idea that he tried to come back to help his team. And so you're trying to like, how do you balance that? Like the rule that's in place right now makes players have to be selfish. Like, well, I'm ready with 3 games to go, but I'll sit out if my team's competitive in the tournament and things like that, or could be. And I think his point is valid. And I think you just have to, like you said, have somebody in your corner willing to say, some magic words in terms of, lawyers and things like that could probably help you out. But he sounded very serious about it. Obviously, he said much of the work gets done after the season, so that nothing was sort of filed or done. And he acknowledged that he doesn't fit the sort of definition of the rule. But that'll be interesting. And I think it is worth noting too that he said it would be Indiana or bust. Not bust, but like his first option would be to check with the new coach and make sure, like, if you want me, I'm here. If not, obviously maybe he'll look elsewhere. But like his focus is staying in Bloomington. And he says, he laughed. He's like, as long as the new coach will have me.
And I mean, like, I think there's probably a lot of value in that. I mean, personally, like, I think you've got a player who's clearly, kind of a leader, a player who's got a strong emotional connection to the program, a player with a ton of Big Ten experience, a player who, it's funny. Like, I actually don't know that we sort of talked enough about his 3-point shooting this season, just because the season
improved significantly.
Consumed with everything else. I mean, like this season he takes he attempts 158 threes. That's career high by one. That's one more than he attempted last season in Illinois. He shoots a career best 39.2%. He shoots 44% in Big Ten play. So he actually shot better in Big Ten play than overall. That's the best conference number he's ever shot by about 7 points. And he also set a record, a personal best for how many attempts he made, how many 3-pointers he attempted in conference play, 109. And that's from a guy that started the season 5 of 20. So, like, he was in that slump at the beginning of the year. And I don't really want to sit here and do the math, but, like, the point is, if you break out basically him finding his sea legs those first, like, 4, 5, 6 games, he was an elite shooter essentially the rest of the year, in addition to posting a career best turnover rate, in addition to being, one of the most efficient scorers in the Big Ten. He actually mixed more kind of 2-pointers, that sort of that mid-range jumper. He mixed in a little bit more. He attempted more free throws this season than he had attempted, basically double the number of free throws he'd attempted in his entire career. In fact, I'm sitting here doing the math. It is almost exactly double. He had attempted 31 free throws in his first 3 years at Illinois. He attempted 58 in Indiana this season. So my point is, he also expanded his game, fairly substantially within the context of, the role Indiana asked for him. He actually finished, I didn't realize this, I'm looking at it now, in conference play alone, he finished with the highest offensive rating in the Big Ten per Ken Pomeroy. Like, there is a ton of value in a player like that, both tangible and intangible.
Well, you mentioned the intangibles. I think you saw not apathy. Maybe it's a little apathy sink in sometimes for players, but with him, and I think that's why Woodson leaned on him, Leal, and Galloway. That he was emotional when players were making mistakes and trying to get players in the right spot. I mean, you saw it time and time again. I thought that he really took it upon himself to, like you said, vocal kind of leadership and be a guy that sort of directs traffic. That to me, I think stood out over that last stretch of 10 games where, after that Illinois game where he sort of spoke about players, him and Leo spoke about players having to look at themselves in the mirror. He didn't just sort of, talk, we walk the walk and he cared about it.
No, I mean, he invited that pressure essentially. and you had players in Anthony Leal and Trey Galloway, and I think Leal tried to maybe be a little bit more of that this year, in part because I think Galloway kind of had to find his game for a little while after the surgery, but I think it almost felt also a little bit in part like Anthony Leal saying, listen, I'll take on a little bit more of the intangible stuff. You focus more of your energy on, the point guard, the trying, because we saw the same thing from Galloway at the end of this season. We saw at the end of last season where it really felt, for better or worse, like he was trying to put the team on his shoulders and carry it forward. But you're losing a couple of those guys now is the point. And now you've got a guy that wants to come back, that wants to kind of have, that sort of, I don't know, that impact, or that, who embraces that role, essentially. I think you could do a lot worse. And also, listen, as somebody who, you've sat next to me for the last 2 years at Assembly Hall when I've just sort of rolled my eyes at how remarkably inefficient Indiana shooting can be at times.
You're not going to kick a 3-point shooter to the curb. I know that. For sure.
Especially not not one at that level. Like,
right.
44% in Big Ten play on better than 5 attempts per game. Like that is an elite number. You just can't let that go.
All right. So before we get, I know everyone wants to talk about coaching. Before we get to coaching, we talked with Goody in the locker room, and I asked him this, and he couldn't. He said it was a good question, and he was very kind of thoughtful, just in terms of like where the season went wrong for them, like what was the issue, and he just like couldn't really pinpoint it. And Miles Rice sort of had a similar answer where there was nothing that sort of to them was one thing. What do you think? We've talked about it a little bit, but I've not gotten a firm answer for you. Where do you think, like, if Woodson got a do-over in reconstructing the roster, obviously he wouldn't be stepping down if he did. But what should he have done differently before the season with this group?
Yeah, before the season is kind of tough to answer. I think, I do think it, and I know you talked a lot about how, it seemed like the highest profile transfers wound up,
taking a backseat,
pretty quickly. The thing that stuck with me, because I think at a certain point you do just have to remove the idea of like, don't get hung up on who's on a big NIL deal or who's not. Like in the heat of the game, you're just trying to win. It doesn't matter if somebody's making the most money on the team or the least money on the team. For me, the bigger issue was it took Mike Woodson way too long to find his best lineups. And I go back to, I've cited this statistic before. Ken Palm's like most frequently used lineups over the last 5 games. Indiana has one, or eventually had one, which was the starting lineup it rolled with at the end at almost 29% sort of usage. And that was Galloway, Leal, Goody, and Bako Ballo. And I thought that lineup really worked because it was so balanced. And because you had multiple shooters on the floor, you had an experienced player in Leal that could handle your toughest defensive matchups, which freed Galloway up, and just to a certain extent Mbako as well, to get on the ball and focus more of their energy and effort offensively. And then you obviously had sort of an anchor point big man in the middle. And if you go down the list, the second most used one was basically Miles Rice from McKenzie and Mbako, so 3 guards, Goody and Ballo. And then the next 4 after that had Malik Renew on the floor, but not Umar Ballo. So you had, if I'm doing the math on those together, they're something around like 30% themselves. Number one, I think Indiana needed to move away from the 2 big lineups. I think we all saw that quicker than they did. But number 2, it was like Indiana found these roles too late. And
do you think there's a cautionary tale for the next coach then, or how to handle NIL? Because the reason he sort of did find it was because he went away. He did. I think it was freeing the idea that you don't have to worry about egos or anything like that, because if somebody's upset, you're leaving anyway. Like that was really where everything turned around, or where he kind of sort of, made some choices he wasn't willing to sort of in the first half of the season. Do you think it's a cautionary tale when you have a high-priced sort of roster that you've got to be more willing to sort of say, like, I guess, put a guy in a bed? You don't think so, though?
No, because again, I think it if you, put it this way, if you get to a comfort level with these, these lineups in November, rather than February. And it may be in February, Indiana's converting some of these close losses to wins because of it. Well, then in these first four lineups I'm looking at, you've got, by all accounts, a well-compensated transfer center playing 38%, 39%, 39% of available minutes at the top end of your roster. You've got Miles Rice mixing it in at about 20% of available minutes in the next two lineups. You've got Luke Goody ever present in all those. There's still transfers there. It's more that, like, I've been hung up on this a lot, and I know I've mentioned it on the podcast, but like the quote that stuck with me more than any other from the Bahamas was when Mike Woodson said after the Louisville game that he thought he had his team in a good place defensively. And then they go to the Bahamas, and like, not only do they struggle, like, it was, I mean, I don't think it's unfair to call it disastrous. You know, the way that they played, particularly against Louisville and in the first half against Gonzaga. And that just, that strikes me as Mike Woodson had a clear idea about what this roster looked like. Maybe the Tennessee exhibition, sort of reinforced some of that. Yeah. And then it turned out that idea was all wrong. And listen, I don't think that's a cautionary tale about NIL. I think it's just a cautionary tale about, knowing your team. Now, maybe that's a little bit, maybe some of that comes back to the idea of the portal and, like being able to figure out how to blend in, guys that you bring in for a year or two with guys that have been with you for 3 or 4 years. Fine. But like, that's the job for anybody now. That's not just a Mike Woodson thing. Whoever Indiana hires after him is going to be sort of in the same position or have to grapple with the same questions. It's not something that is just going to suddenly go away, if that makes sense. And so I think to me, like, what struck me, and I know we talked about this in the podcast, and I think I said it in relation to or contextualized by the quote from the Bahamas. There was a while here with this most frequent lineups thing. There wasn't a lineup over like 14, 15%. It was clear that Mike Woodson was hunting. He was looking mid-season for what his best rotations were. And it seemed like, at least taking him at his word, he thought he knew what the answer to that in the preseason. And then he lost that answer in the non-conference, and he didn't get it back again until too late on. And there are a host of different things that kind of go into that. Again, a lot of people talked about getting rid of the too big basketball, a lot earlier, and that's fine. And there were some other things, like, for example, I think it would have been fair of Woodson to expect a little bit more in terms of stretching the floor from somebody like Malik Renew, who, was 15 and 45 from three last year. That's not a bad number for a big. Well, this year he makes 3 in 24 attempts. Suddenly his three-point shot has just completely disappeared. He missed all 9 that he took in Big Ten play. But I just think that Indiana lost touch with, what it thought it was going to be in the preseason, and whether it was because they couldn't find it, or, to your point, maybe it wasn't until Mike Woodson kind of felt free of obligation to the future that he was able to just kind of do what he wanted and do what made sense. I don't know, but it just felt like they found that too late this season. And if maybe, the sort of developments that we're talking about in mid-late February are happening in mid-late December, then Indiana probably wins a couple more Big Ten games. And, listen,
maybe that's tied to if you play the stronger schedule, then, you get back, you think Bahamas maybe is a fluke. Well, you face a couple more tests because they win all those other non-conference games and sort of say, like, well, we'll be okay. Maybe it's all tied together. Maybe they needed 2 more games, another butt kicking, essentially, to sort of say, like, oh, we're not at the level we need to be, and we need to sort of reconfigure things here. And so maybe it's just all sort of, and I think maybe that speaks to the fact that there isn't just one thing you can change and fix this whole thing. That this was sort of a series of errors that escalated, obviously, into what the season turned out to be, just a giant disappointment.
To kind of put a bow, I guess, really quickly on just sort of like Indiana's roster and what's next. We'll talk about the coaching search at the end. Yes, I am intentionally making you all wait because we need to talk about the women too, because they are actually in the NCAA tournament, and I am intrigued by their draw. as I said, the portal's open. To my knowledge, no one's in it yet. I would be surprised if we don't see a number of players with eligibility remaining enter it. That doesn't mean they can't come back. I said this around you and I both said this around the Curt Cignetti, the Tom Allen Curt Cignetti transition. A roster that comes apart quickly can come back together, either with similar players or new faces relatively quickly as well. The one thing that's worth saying is I don't expect Indiana. I've banged this drum before. I wrote something on this today. I would keep emphasizing it because I don't think people have fully appreciated it, frankly. And it is something that's important to remember. The April 7th deadline for the House settlement's expected to be approved on that date. From that date forward, any NIL deal that is certified has to go through the clearinghouse, which means any NIL deal before that time doesn't. And that means, if we can just state it plainly, NIL deals can remain very, very large without having to justify the quote-unquote fair market value analysis or having to satisfy the fair market value analysis for one more year. You put revenue sharing on top of that. That is a considerable amount of resource to rebuild this roster. And while I do not expect Indiana to be offering or entering into NIL deals with current players before the next coach is hired, you can certainly at least have informal conversations to say, hey, stick with us, keep us in mind. Will you give the new coach a chance? Because we're still going to be able to be competitive in compensating you if you're interested in sticking around when the new guy shows up. The other thing that is happening now, we've already seen some games announced. The Marquette game's been announced. We already knew the Kentucky game was on the schedule. There's some others that have floated around. I think you're probably going to see Louisville back on the schedule based on what I've heard. I don't think that's official yet. I don't think that's like signed, sealed, delivered, but I would not be at all surprised to see Louisville back on the schedule for next year. There's going to be some stuff that just has to happen because this is the time of year that you put some of these things together to plan for next season, regardless of who your head coach is. That's not necessarily a signal of this or that, of this is happening or that's happening. But the point is, the wheels got to keep turning here a little bit for IU basketball, even while Scott Dolson is looking for its next head coach.
Correct.
That's all you have to add.
I mean, it was sort of a laundry list of like points, but yes, that's it was a good job.
I appreciate your vote of confidence. Let's talk about the women's team selected into the field. I know you were up until the small hours last night writing about them. They're in the 8-9 game against Utah in South Carolina's regional. Obviously, that sets up an intriguing sort of rematch of the IU South Carolina game that was so exciting. I've contended for a while that while I'm not going to sit here and predict this team to go to a Final Four or anything, it seemed like they were in that 8-9 range, maybe 10 range if things had gone a certain way. And it just strikes me this is the sort of team a 1 or a 2 really doesn't want to see in the second round because they can score in bunches and they can make a lot of shots. Now, I'm not predicting they're going to upset South Carolina, for example. But, if you look at South Carolina, I mean, that's not a team with 1 or 2 dominant players a la Southern Cal. That is a team that is very much kind of a product of a team that is the sum of its parts. And if Indiana could find a little bit of shooting rhythm quickly, then it's not hard for me to imagine. Obviously, they got to get through the 8-9 game first. Let's assume they do. It's not hard for me to imagine Indiana suddenly becoming a real headache for a 1 seed because of the way this team is constructed.
Well, I mean, it's interesting, though, too, that Utah team is sort of built similarly. They're one of the top 3-point shooting teams in the country. Number 6 in made 3-pointers, number 13 in attempts, 26 attempts per game. You'd love to see that. And then they shoot 37%, also in the top 10. So, that first round game, you say, well, assume they can get past it. That's an interesting one because Indiana has sort of been boom or bust, and going against another team that could take a very similar approach, who's on, who's not. I could see Indiana, because they've been a team that hasn't really hit their ceiling this year very consistently. I mean, they had a couple nice wins, obviously Baylor and Ohio State, but not anywhere consistent enough for what Terry Moran expected at this point of the season. And so I could see them easily getting tripped up in that first round if Utah just sort of, goes on tilt. Their team, you make 11 threes in a game, they made 13 or more, I think 5 times. I mean, that's hard to keep up with, even for an Indiana team that likes to shoot. But like you said, they got veterans, 3 of them that have been to a lot of tournament and played in a lot of tournament games in terms of Clay Moore-McNeil, Sidney Parrish, and Yarden Garzone. So, you just don't know. Is the team capable of making another run to the Sweet 16? Absolutely. I think they have the talent. Have I seen anything this season that says that they will do that? I'd be reluctant to say so. I just don't think they've been consistent enough. And they seem they get up for big games. They played obviously UCLA and USC 2 times against USC, once against UCLA, all single digit losses, but just can't. I guess the hump's there too. It's just
no. I mean, that's an interesting thing to parse with this team. Is like, on the one hand, let's say they get through that 8-9 game, and I think you're right to point out, like, you can't just wave Utah away. But let's say they get through that 8-9 game. On the one hand, if you're a 1 seed, you're looking at them and saying, well, they're not afraid of going toe to toe with some of the best teams in the country. I mean, and it wasn't just at home, right? Like and I know the time change was probably a little bit of a thing. We thought that would be a thing for the men with Oregon. It wasn't. Maybe it was a little bit more with the women against Southern Cal playing in the noon game in Indianapolis. But the point is, they did it on a neutral floor too. They were, incredibly competitive against an elite opponent with elite players on a neutral floor as well as at home. On the other hand, it's justifiable to say, yeah, but they didn't actually win any of those games. So, you can sort of respect it, I guess, if you're a team like South Carolina, while also still maybe believing, okay, but when they come up against this level, they don't quite have enough. I think the other thing that helps them is, and this will be, against Utah and against South Carolina if they get through, is what you mentioned, is just veteran presence. And, this team doesn't have a lot. I mean, ultimately doesn't have a lot of time left with these, with these players that have been around for kind of this golden age here. I mean, like Chloe Moore-McNeil's in her 5th year. Obviously, Sidney Parrish, kind of has an interesting sort of perspective on it, because, I mean, she watched IU women's basketball kind of rise up when she was in high school, decided to go to Oregon instead, then came back to be a part of it. But, it does feel a little bit like, I mean, I don't want to be overly dramatic, but a bit of an end of a generation kind of thing, for this program, in terms of, not dissimilar to when Amanda Cahill and Tyra Buss, kind of that run ended, or that era ended. It doesn't feel enormously dissimilar to that to me, with Chloe Moore-McNeil, with Sidney Parrish, players who've been around for Grace Berger and Mackenzie Holmes, and have been around for a lot of the success that Indiana's had in the last, 4 or 5 years. I mean, you do think that the experience is obviously going to be a help, but you also wonder about the sense of urgency versus maybe any sense of pressure that anybody might feel to say, this is our last opportunity together. Let's make the most of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's that Chloe set the games, played record, beat Grace Berger's record in a season finale against Purdue. So I think you had 151 and counting. So I mean, you kind of see how much she's meant to the program. I mean, she's one of the 3rd all-time winningest player. 75% win percentage in her career. So you talk about kind of what they've been able to accomplish, and she's been there for most of it, the last kind of 5 of the last 6 years in the tournament. So yeah, like you said, kind of this roster is going to probably have to look a lot different next year. I mean, there's a couple pieces coming back, but I think one of the things that's just held them back a little bit, is the depth piece, and that is I think that's the kind of the counterpoint to, yes, they have veteran leadership, but it's hard to ride them 40 minutes, twice in 3 nights. They just don't have a lot of depth right now. Injuries have played a role. Terry's always very veteran heavy to begin with. On top of it, and it's just like, what are you getting off the bench? And scoring, Lexus Bargesser, I think, is just a tremendous defender. But just offensively, they just can't get anything off the bench, really. And so I think that's sort of been, another thing that's sort of, and I think fans are kind of growing more vocal as you're just like, you have nothing there, and you're, kind of killing your stars a little bit. some of that's been out of necessity, but I do think that come tournament time, you do need something, and I'm just not sure it's there for them. And I think that might, like I said, be the sort of the counterpoint to that veteran presence that they have.
I also think it's fascinating and probably something we should talk about in the offseason, just kind of like where Indiana goes from here. And I think probably that's worth kind of going through the portal first, because there, it's not necessarily quite this clean, but there have kind of been these three distinct eras of like, sort of the first team that Terry Morin took over that was really anchored by Tyra Buss and Amanda Cahill and a couple others, that got Indiana kind of consistently into the tournament picture, won a game in the tournament, then won the WNIT, and that was where Indiana got like the big crowds and sort of looked around and said, this is what we're capable of. Then there were the teams that were really sort of, Ali Patberg was obviously such a big piece of kind of the next group that came through, Brenna Wise, and then that kind of fed, relatively seamlessly into the Grace Berger, Mackenzie Holmes, Chloe Moore McNeil era. Sydney Parrish joins that group. Obviously, you have transfers like Sarah Segalia and Shay Chesky who sort of fill important roles. But it feels like kind of there's another big turnover coming, a little bit in terms of Indiana. It feels like it's going to have to be, very, it feels like Indiana is going to have to be, kind of either confident in its recruiting as the Indiana Gatorade Player of the Year coming in next year, or really aggressive in the portal, or both. And so I think that, once the dust settles on kind of the spring portal cycle on the women's side, I think it'll be worth kind of discussing that again. You have all waited long enough, and I don't know if we're going to give you enough to make you feel happy about it. But let's talk about the coaching search. I think certainly first to frame it within the context of the season ending, other than like literally finding the guy, Scott Dolson's sort of, I think, number one priority for a long time was to make sure the search did not encroach upon the season, to sort of keep the spotlight trained on the players and Mike Woodson for as long as they were still going. That's off the table now. All eyes are going to turn to this. I'm on record as saying I think we're in, I'm not comfortable with the prediction. If I was, I'd probably just report it. But I would go on record as saying I think we're talking in days, not weeks at this point. I don't mean necessarily by the end of this week, but I mean like, at the beginning of the search, we knew it was going to be a weeks-long process. Now I think we're talking about this moving relatively quickly, whether that's when somebody falls out of the tournament this coming weekend, whether that's waiting another weekend after that, whether it's somebody who's not in the tournament. I do think this is moving along. I do think this is going to gain steam pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, but that was the sort of the timeline that was outlined sort of ahead of time. When I think this thing started, that like, look, these first 3 weeks, was it 3 weeks or 4 weeks, was all going to be kind of done the due diligence and background work that allow us to, once this thing is over, and we could sort of give Mike Woodson the exit that they felt, he was deserving him as a Hall of Fame player and one of the team's all-time leading scorers, that we could be respectful to that, and then sort of once that's over, turn the page and have the search firm. They've got the search firm in place and turnkey that they use for football. They have sort of the fruits of the labor of Scott Dolson's team in terms of like the research that they did and breakdown of different, what makes teams at their level successful and things like that. So now they're good to go. And, you have to imagine they've got a fairly firm list of candidates that they've sort of probably vetted and, put out feelers, through the search firm.
I'm trying to think of asking this in a way that's not asking you for a prediction, but I'm curious for, all manner of names have floated out there. And I'm just curious for your perspective on maybe what coaching profile, for lack of a better word, you think makes the most sense for this job? Like, is it someone who's got a strong track record offensively? Is it someone who already has high major experience? I know my opinions, but I'm kind of curious for yours. And if there's somebody that pops off the page, I'm not saying, this is not us trying to make a silent nod toward anything, I promise. But if there's someone that pops off the page, you want to share that, please feel free. But I'm just curious,
Well, you focused a lot on the X's and O's, but I almost think that in terms of an Indiana job, with sort of the pressure and what you're going to be dealing with, but I think the roster construction with the NIL of it all, I think having some background in that kind of stuff would be very sort of beneficial, especially since you're going to kind of be building a roster, not maybe from scratch, but very close to it. And I think you're going to want somebody, I think the joke is they want a Signetti type, but it's not necessarily Signetti type. It's the idea that they have a very clear vision for a roster construction. That's not just basketball. Like, oh, I want a lot, like run this offense or have this defense, pressure, whatever. That's all fine. But the idea of here's how you're going to give me this crazy amount of revenue sharing that's going to be in the top quarter of the Big Ten, a quarter of the country. Here's what I'm going to do with it. Here's how I'm going to build. Here's how I'm going to avoid the mistakes you guys have made or we've made. When he's pitching himself for the job over the last 3 years. Do you plan to go back to making high school recruiting more of a feature rather than sort of like the one guy? Is it just building to the transfer portal? What's that vision like? Because I think that's what ultimately won Signetti the job, is that he sort of had this clear idea of like, at Indiana, here's how we're going to win. And so I think having a coach with sort of that vision and a little bit of experience there, because I do think there's a difference between having no money and having all this and, to kind of juggling the personalities like we talked about, the idea of having a guy that's making 7 figures, maybe getting outplayed by somebody that's making half of that or less. How do you deal with all that? And I do think it's sort of a different time where you could say like, oh, a young coach has no experience in the Power 4 level, could do a great job basketball wise. Sure. I think that's always going to be the case in terms of like what the product looks like. But I think that this job now has become much more than that, or these jobs, or there's a small group of jobs that have this kind of money involved that I do think are different. Am I wrong on that? I don't know. What's your
No,
thought?
I mean, I think like what I think you're talking about, if we are looking for Signetti comparisons, and this is where like someone like Ben McCollum has intrigued me through this process, is someone who at very least has enough experience running their own program, whether they're in their 40s or their 60s, has enough experience over several years sort of building a roster and understanding sort of the ideal intersection points between, sort of like where do you make your personnel meet your system versus where do you make your system meet your personnel? Because I think that was something that Mike Woodson struggled with at times. And I certainly think that was something Archie Miller struggled with at times is, it's great to go out and win a bunch of recruiting battles, but if you can't get those players comfortable with what you ask them to do on the floor, then it really doesn't matter. On the other hand, if you are so sort of rigid to your system, then you wind up maybe recruiting players that don't develop in long term the way you need to or whatever. So I think someone who whether it's someone who's done it at a high major level for a long time, or it's somebody who maybe has done it at a lower level but also still done it for a long time. I think someone who has sort of a lot of experience, and again, this was something that I think really appealed about Signetti, was someone who has a lot of experience sort of, or a track record of, this is how I manage a roster and this is how it leads to winning. I know what I'm looking for in a player to fit. I know what my roster needs in terms of skills and roles and sort of makeup, and I know how to identify that in a player. And again, in the modern era, some of that's going to have to be portal, some have to be high school. Like there's no way around that. But I think that's important. The other thing that jumps out to me, and I don't really know exactly how to quantify this, but I do think, especially if you're going to hire a sitting head coach, and presumably someone with a decently long CV, at least 5, 6, 7 years, I also think there's an argument kind of for the idea that if I'm sitting in that chair, I want to see some proof that somewhere along the way, that head coach showed they could win at a really high level, like a really substantial just quantity level. Like I've had some people bring up, and I have. I mean, we're talking on Monday, March 17th. I have not heard anyone credible sort of, seriously talk about Chris Collins at Northwestern. But he's a name that's come up. It's a name that comes up, in any number of jobs because, in fairness to him, Collins has done a good job at what is historically a very difficult program. He is famously the first coach to take Northwestern to the NCAA tournament. He's done it 3 times now, if I'm not mistaken. Northwestern has won a game every single time he's gotten into the tournament. There haven't been any first fours in there. It's not like Northwestern was sneaking in, the back door, so to speak. But I also look at Chris Collins, and I just, I see, I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I see 3 times as many seasons where where he has a losing record in conference play compared to seasons he's made the NCAA tournament. And I say that's a tough job, and he's done well in it. But I don't see the evidence that there's another gear to go up if you suddenly free some of the shackles of, how hard it is to get players in Northwestern, how hard it is to be in the portal when you have, schools like that tend to have like smaller graduate programs, which means it's harder to go find, sort of a place to put a player academically so you can get them in out of the portal, that kind of thing. I get all that. But a lot of those challenges also aren't necessarily transferable to Indiana, a place like Indiana. A lot of the skills that you develop in winning at a place with those specific challenges don't necessarily transfer cleanly. Whereas I would look at somebody, again, and I brought up McCollum earlier just because I do think he's an intriguing name for someone in this coaching cycle, whether it's Indiana or, he's also been linked to Iowa, that's where he's from, or somebody else. I don't know. I can't be sure that he can go up to, that really high major level that Indiana is going to expect. But I do look at his history and I say he knows how to manage winning. And he knows how to, sort of build a team that at its level is consistently excellent. And that was something that really stuck out about Cignetti. Even before we saw him coach a game, even before everything that happened last season, it was basically everywhere he'd been, with the exception of Elon, which was still a really good coaching job. He just wasn't there that long. He was only there 2 years. Everywhere he'd been, he had succeeded at a really, really high level. And every time he'd stepped up a level, whether it was from D2 to the FCS, or whether it was from a smaller job in the FCS to a bigger job in the FCS, or whether it was from the FCS to the FBS, every time he'd stepped up, the way he built a team, the way he tried to win, translated. And that's why that idea of, again, whether it's someone who's been at the D2 level and stepped up, or someone at the mid-major level and stepped up, or whatever, just the idea that at some point in your career you showed you were capable of, relative to the level you were at, winning at an excellent clip. And I think that is something that has kind of stayed with me as well.
A lot of the comments today have been a lot of Brad Brownell has gotten a lot of scorn. Justified or no?
I mean, I have time for Brownell. Like, basically what the Brownell argument boils down to is very simple, and this is my understanding. He went to 2 NCAA tournaments, or 3, or am I right about that? Yeah, no, 2 NCAA tournaments in his first 10 seasons at Clemson. One first round appearance, 1 Sweet 16 appearance. And, there were some long stretches in there where the results were pretty underwhelming. I think he was on the hot seat a couple times. And then in the last 5 years, he's been to 3 NCAA tournaments. He's got 4 winning records in the ACC in the last 5 years. Clemson's a Ken Pom top 20 team each of the last 2 years, and they finished tied for second, only a game behind Duke in the regular season title race this year. The argument against Brownell is basically that, his results have improved as the ACC's gotten worse. The argument for him is that it's only been in the last 4 or 5 years that he's really had the NIL resources to not just compete, but sustain, or not just build, but sustain a really high level roster. And basically, these are the results. And so with Brownell, and I would also point out, and I'm not, I don't want to sound like I'm advocating for anybody. I know I just kind of, I probably did a little bit for Ben McCollum. I'm not trying to advocate for anybody, and I, hand to God, no one has told me to give a silent nod toward this person or that person or whatever. The other thing I would point out is, during his years at UNC Wilmington and Wright State, Brownell was regarded in the way that we regard someone like Ben McCollum now. And he wasn't quite winning. He wasn't winning at quite that level, but he had 6 20-win seasons in 8 years. He had a winning record in conference play in 7 of those 8 years, split evenly between Wilmington and Wright State. He went to, I think, the 3 NCAA tournaments. Wright State, I think, won its conference in his last year there before he went to Clemson. Like, he was regarded as one of the most promising up-and-coming coaches at that time. I remember, and I was a much younger reporter then, but I remember when, there were sort of discussions about, like, if Tom Crean doesn't work out, because, of course, Tom Crean's first 2 or 3 years were pretty difficult. If Tom Crean doesn't work out, where does Indiana turn next? Obviously, Brad Stevens was at the top of everybody's list. He was doing what he was doing at Butler. But Brad Brownell was not that far removed from that conversation. There were people who believed, especially because of his in-state ties, he was born in Evansville, played at DePaul, that, he should at least be in that conversation. So what I'm trying to say is I kind of see it both ways with Brad Brownell. I don't know that, I think it's fair to say, based on some of the comments we're seeing, based on, some of the internet discussion, I think it would probably be a harder hire to sell than some others. But I don't listen. If you talk to people in college basketball, they will tell you that the sort of, I guess, the cons to sort of Brad Brownell's resume are overplayed a little bit, and the pros are underplayed a little bit, and that there is a genuine argument that, Brownell's the kind of coach that, if he took that step up, could succeed. It's not guaranteed, but there are people who will vouch for him. There are people who will stick with him on that score.
Well, I do think it's under sort of, I don't know, to me, like, that's not an easy place to sort of win in basketball.
No, it is a black hole. I grew up in the South. It's a black hole.
And where they are geographically, trying to recruit against that's not a spot where you go, like, I want to plant my flag and just and find immediate success. The fact that
what it comes down to is there's not a ton of basketball talent in South Carolina. There's quite a bit in Georgia, particularly around Atlanta, and there's quite a bit in North Carolina, because there's obviously a lot of sort of cultural importance attached to the sport in North Carolina. But the problem is, it's really hard to get kids away from Duke.
That's what I'm saying. Like, if any good kids are going to want to go to the school the north of you. So, like, I don't know. I think when you look at his resume, I think it's more impressive than, like, all these fans are saying. They're gonna riot and storm the Cook Hall. I just don't see that. I don't see it's worthy of that scorn. I don't know. The idea that he's not good enough. I just don't. I just, based on looking at his, I just don't see it. The level of distaste for his candidacy, I guess, surprises me.
No, like I said, there are people who will genuinely tell you that he's an underappreciated head coach, that he's done a good job at Clemson. I think he has. Again, that is if they went, I shouldn't say if, because the field was selected last night, but I had this statistic for something that I put together that I think we wound up not putting out, or I amended it, or I took it out. I don't remember. But he now owns fully 1/3 of Clemson's NCAA tournament appearances all time. They've only been to, if I'm not mistaken, they've only been to 15 tournaments, and he's guided them to 5 of them. So, certainly, put it this way, certainly at Clemson, he is, I think it's fair to say, far and away the best coach you've ever. I don't know if he's their all-time winningest coach or not, but he is almost certainly the most successful coach they've ever had. That is a place where, if you look at, like, their year by year, there have been, there have been some kind of bursts of light, but a lot of it is, for example, I think Rick Barnes is there for 4 years, and they go to the tournament 3 times, and then Barnes is gone. The Clemson I grew up with was Larry Shiat and Ollie Parnell, and Purnell, I think, took off for DePaul. If maybe I'm remembering that wrong, but I think he did. Chiat never went to the tournament. Purnell was kind of punching uphill for a long time. He did. Yeah, Purnell left, I think maybe trying to kind of get out ahead of the posse to go to DePaul, where it never really worked for him there, obviously. The point is, it's just, I mean, it's a bad job. It's a very difficult job. And the only coaches that have succeeded there consistently, other than Brownell, are coaches who generally have had success all over, like Rick Barnes. Barnes got him to 3 tournaments. Cliff Ellis, who also took Auburn to, I think, a Sweet 16, and then had some really good years at Coastal Carolina near the end of his career. He took him to 3 NCAA tournaments. But again, Brownell is the only coach to take him to 5. That is a program record for a head coach, and that is a difficult job. And I would say it's a difficult job that to me is still has more sort of translatable skills than a job like Northwestern, where what you have to do, or a Stanford or someplace like that, where what you have to do to succeed there is a little bit distinct to what you need to do to succeed at like a land-grant university that has a large alumni base and plenty of reach, but just not a lot of cultural sort of interest in basketball.
And I don't know, some of these comments, who Dusty, who's the candidate then? Who are these guys that are IU's missing on? That does McCallum win the press conference? Like, who wins the press conference at this point outside of? Oh, you're muting yourself because you don't want to get.
No, I didn't mean to mute myself. We're not.
I think the fan base is so fractured at this moment, and of the last 2 decades maybe, that there's no winning the press conference no matter who it is, right? Other than if it's one guy, but outside that one guy, there's probably not a winning press conference, right?
I mean, there's somebody here who says 5 tournaments in 15 years is another Mike Woodson. What you're banking on is that 5 tournaments in 15 years at Clemson is like 13 tournaments in 15 years at Indiana. And I'm not sure I'm not sitting here and guaranteeing that's possible. That's what you're banking on, though, is that 5 tournaments in 15 years at Clemson is double that or more at Indiana, where money and fan interest and booster support and cultural importance are not problems, are not things that you have to overcome. Now, the ACC, I mean, I have time for all the criticism, and I don't know, I did not mean for this to get dragged into Brad Brownell talk specifically, but I'm not endorsing or condemning it. I'm just saying it's what you're banking on is that the job he did the work he did in a bad job is,
translates to taking a good program to a higher level. Yes.
Yes. And then if you take a higher level program, then maybe you take that to an even higher level.
No, and I think, but just getting, I mean, just in a broader picture sense, I just don't know. I mean, you see the comments again. I mean, one person said McCollum would win the press conference, but I'm not sure who these list of the guys that Indiana's passed on. Or didn't get here. I don't know.
The thing we really need to get past, obviously, is winning the press conference. It's never been less important. Because the whole point of winning the press conference is you got to energize the fans and you've got to be charismatic for the players. You're paying them now. So energizing the fans is fundraising for, either NIL money or for, sort of booster support for rev share budgets. And impressing the players is being able to put a competitive number in front of them next to a really good opportunity to develop and get better and go on to the NBA. It's almost I'm not trying to be flippant, but I remember in 2021 somebody talking about winning the press conference, and I said, "There's not even going to be a press conference. It's COVID. Whatever they do, they're going to do on Zoom. I doubt any of us will be there," and we weren't. It was all like a Zoom press conference. It's very strange with a bit of hindsight. They had a podium in an empty press room, and Scott Dolson spoke, and there were a few people in the room, but none of us were. We were all watching on our computer. The point is, it's not about winning the press conference anymore. That just doesn't exist. You need to you put it this way: you need to win the Twitter far more than you need to win the press conference. And Twitter.
We should before we go. I mean, the Chris Beard, Will Wade debate. I mean, would you want to wade in? And
all I will say is I have not gotten any sense that Wade has any traction in Indiana. I have gotten a firm sense Chris Beard does not, and in all likelihood, will never have any traction at Indiana.
But the more the question was, because I mean, people are talking about these two specifically in terms of them being, their preferred guy. Is that would you guys that do have baggage? Would you be leery of them at Indiana? What's your sort of take?
I think we need to be careful about like how far we dig into that question.
Well, no, I'm not saying them specifically, like just in general. I think how do you weigh that part of it?
Like whether it's baggage or it's personality issues or whatever, there are levels to it, and I think there's some things that Indiana would be more comfortable with than others, and that's probably.
I'm saying you. What are your?
No, I understand that, I mean, I guess especially in this sort of modern era, I would probably be the same way. But I don't really want to interject my opinion too much on that. I do want to.
I'm not saying on them specifically. The idea of somebody with just checkered past or resume, things on their resume that aren't glowing things. Would you sort of have a hard time? And I think that was sort of how I'd couch it. Not them specifically. Or it doesn't have to be a named person.
The last thing I'll throw in here is Tuxedo Trading says, McCollum and Brownell, what about the idea of a left field candidate? And the only reason that I include this is because of something that I wrote today that may actually already be up on ndStar.com. If it is, I will link it in the comments or the bio or whatever, wherever you pull out all the chapters and things for the podcast on YouTube. I am not saying there is a left field candidate. I don't know if there is one. I know there's a theory out there that there is. There are all sorts of theories out there. It is to Scott Dolson's credit that, frankly, there is such an information vacuum. He has kept his circle so tight that so few people actually know what's going on. It is entirely possible that Indiana winds up hiring someone whose name has been attached to the job for days, if not weeks. That does not necessarily mean that any of us were right to be talking about them at the time. Dolson has genuinely done a very good job, by my impression, of keeping information very sort of tightly controlled through the search. I did make one comparison in what I wrote, which was, I've been around for 1, 2, 3, 4, now 5 men's basketball coaching hires at Indiana, which tells a certain story. But this search has reminded me a little bit of 2006, when there was like such a sort of public consensus, and there was this feeling that Indiana was striking out with this coach and with that coach, and it wasn't really clear if any of that was true. And there was a lot of, Indiana's just aiming, Indiana's expecting too much or aiming too high, but no one really had any actual sourcing around that. No one actually could prove that Indiana was aiming too high and missing with all these coaches. And it kind of got down to this place where conventional wisdom was it was either Steve Alford, John Beilein, or Tom Crean. And it was just a question of like, where's it going to go? Where's it going to go? And then one day it was just Kelvin Sampson, and no one really saw that coming. And I don't want to rehash all of Kelvin Sampson's, indiscretions at Oklahoma or Indiana. But my point is, that search did kind of play out the way we're talking about, where all the focus was on what people perceived to be obvious candidates who wound up getting kind of, sort of lodged into the sort of public consciousness at such a level that it was like no one could see past them. And then one day there was a completely left field candidate, and essentially you snap your fingers and he's hired. Now, I know the process can't work that way in the same way that it, when you have a social media news cycle, sort of a never-ending news cycle. I understand the process can't be that locked down the way it was 19 years ago. But I did include that in my story today just to point out it's not like Indiana's never done that before. I don't know if you have anything to add.
I mean, that's a good hit. No, that's a appropriate history lesson. It's good.
There you go. Well, then we'll leave it there. He's Mike Niziolek. I'm Zach Osterman. This has been Mind Your Banners from March 17th, 2025. Are you going on the road with the women, Mike?
I am not. I will be here.
You're not. All right. And I'm not going anywhere for a little while, mostly because I live in a plague house right now. Everyone in my family is sick.
Wait, Mark has been asking about spring football. We will. We will.
Yeah, we will talk about spring football. To be honest, like the other reason we're not talking about spring football right now is it's literally paused. It's spring break. They're like everybody's off campus. There's no practices. But yes, there will be more spring football. Again, I would when I say days, not weeks. I don't have a specific timeline in mind, but I do think we're probably entering the sort of death throes of the basketball coaching search, which means we'll probably have some time in April, especially gearing up toward the spring game, to talk more about spring football. We will absolutely. I like this last one. Good show. Just no Brownell. In the comments. We will have time for all that. We'll be back probably next week unless something happens before then. He's Mike Niziolek. I'm Zach Osterman. Thank you all so much for joining us. It's been a lot of fun. We will talk to you soon.